Officer Ray Dawson had been a cop for over 20 years in the quiet town of Fairview. He prided himself on keeping order, though many knew his version of order was heavily skewed by prejudice. To him, young black men were always suspects, and black women were always up to something. He had never been disciplined for his behavior. His colleagues either turned a blind eye or secretly agreed with him. But one day, his entire world shifted. It started like any other day. Ray was patrolling the affluent part of town when he noticed a sleek black BMW parked outside a cafe. A black woman in a tailored white suit stepped out, adjusting her sunglasses. Something about her confidence irked him. She walked with her head high, her posture screaming that she belonged there. And Ray didn't like that. He pulled up behind her, flashing his lights. She barely looked in his direction. License and registration, he barked as he stepped out of the car. The woman raised an eyebrow and took her time retrieving her documents. "And what exactly is the reason for this stop, officer?" Her voice was calm but firm. Ray scoffed. "Suspicious activity. This isn't exactly your neighborhood, is it?" The woman chuckled, a low, amused sound that made his jaw tighten. "And what neighborhood do you think I belong in?" "Just hand over your ID," he snapped. She did. Dr. Aaliyah Carter. The name rang a bell, but he ignored it. He ran her information through his system, expecting something, anything, to come up. Maybe a speeding ticket, an expired registration, some justification for stopping her. But she was clean. Spotless. "You're free to go," he muttered, shoving her license back at her. Aaliyah took her time putting it away. "You sure you don't want to apologize?" Ray bristled. "Apologize? For what?" "For harassing an innocent citizen," she said smoothly, taking a step closer. "But don't worry, Officer Dawson. We'll talk again soon." He watched her walk into the cafe, still fuming but strangely unsettled. Something about her confidence, her certainty, felt like a warning. A sudden shift in power. 3 days later, Ray was called into the precinct for a mandatory meeting. He figured it was some routine protocol update. But when he stepped into the room, his stomach dropped. At the head of the table sat Dr. Aaliyah Carter. Gone was the casual elegance of the woman in the cafe. Now, she wore a navy blue power suit, her ID badge clipped to her lapel. Beside her stood the police chief, arms crossed. "Officer Dawson," the chief said, his voice tight. "Meet Dr. Carter, the new head of the Fairview Civilian Oversight Committee." Ray felt his face flush. He had heard rumors that the city was bringing in an expert to lead police reform efforts, but he never imagined it would be her. Aaliyah smiled, slow and deliberate. "Looks like we do get to talk again, after all." Ray swallowed. He had spent decades abusing his badge, believing he was untouchable. But now, the very woman he had tried to intimidate had the power to hold him accountable. For the first time in his career, Officer Ray Dawson felt afraid. Ray Dawson sat stiffly in the meeting room, his palms damp with sweat. His usual arrogance was nowhere to be found. The other officers in the room shifted uncomfortably, clearly sensing the tension. Dr. Aaliyah Carter crossed her legs gracefully, her sharp eyes locking onto Ray's. "Before we begin, Officer Dawson, I want to ask you something." Ray swallowed hard. "Yes, ma'am?" "3 days ago, you pulled me over without cause," she said, her voice calm but razor sharp. "I'd like to hear why." Ray hesitated. He could lie. He could say something about protocol or suspicious behavior. But looking at her now, sitting at the head of the table, surrounded by officials who actually wanted change, he knew there was no getting out of this. I misjudged the situation, he muttered, avoiding eye contact. Aaliyah tilted her head, her expression unreadable. Misjudged? Or did you assume that a black woman in an expensive car didn't belong in a wealthy neighborhood? The silence in the room was suffocating. Ray's colleagues glanced at each other, shifting in their seats. The chief cleared his throat but said nothing. Ray started, but Aaliyah raised a hand, cutting him off. You see, Officer Dawson, she said, leaning forward, I was appointed to lead this committee for a reason. Your actions aren't unique. They're part of a pattern, a culture of policing that has gone unchecked for too long. But that ends now. Ray clenched his jaw. So what happens next? Aaliyah smiled, but there was no warmth in it. Well, that depends. We'll be reviewing all civilian complaints against you. Your record, your stops, your use of force history. And if we find misconduct, you'll be held accountable. Ray's stomach twisted. He had dozens of complaints against him, most dismissed, some swept under the rug. But now? Now, they'd be under a microscope. And if I refuse to cooperate? He asked, though he already knew the answer. Aaliyah leaned back, folding her hands. Then I hope you enjoy early retirement, Officer Dawson. The consequences. Over the next few weeks, Ray felt the walls closing in. Every report he had written, every traffic stop he had made, every complaint filed against him, it was all being scrutinized. Then, the final blow came. A citywide press conference. Aaliyah Carter stood at the podium, poised and powerful. After a full review of Fairview PD, we have uncovered a troubling pattern of racial profiling, abuse of power, and negligence in addressing misconduct. Effective immediately, Officer Ray Dawson has been suspended pending further investigation. Ray watched it unfold on his living room TV, his fists clenched. He had spent years thinking he was untouchable. Now, the very people he had oppressed were deciding his fate. And for the first time in his life, he knew what it felt like to be powerless. Ray Dawson sat stiffly in the meeting room, his palms damp with sweat. His usual arrogance was nowhere to be found. The other officers in the room shifted uncomfortably, clearly sensing the tension. Dr. Aaliyah Carter crossed her legs gracefully, her sharp eyes locking onto Ray's. Before we begin, Officer Dawson, I want to ask you something. Ray swallowed hard. Yes, ma'am? 3 days ago, you pulled me over without cause, she said, her voice calm but razor-sharp. I'd like to hear why. Ray hesitated. He could lie. He could say something about protocol or suspicious behavior. But looking at her now, sitting at the head of the table, surrounded by officials who actually wanted change, he knew there was no getting out of this. I misjudged the situation, he muttered, avoiding eye contact. Aaliyah tilted her head, her expression unreadable. Misjudged? Or did you assume that a black woman in an expensive car didn't belong in a wealthy neighborhood? The silence in the room was suffocating. Ray's colleagues glanced at each other, shifting in their seats. The chief cleared his throat but said nothing. Ray started, but Aaliyah raised a hand, cutting him off. You see, Officer Dawson, she said, leaning forward, I was appointed to lead this committee for a reason. Your actions aren't unique. They're part of a pattern, a culture of policing that has gone unchecked for too long. But that ends now. Ray clenched his jaw. So what happens next? Aaliyah smiled, but there was no warmth in it. Well, that depends. We'll be reviewing all civilian complaints against you. Your record, your stops, your use of force history. And if we find misconduct, you'll be held accountable." Ray's stomach twisted. He had dozens of complaints against him, most dismissed, some swept under the rug. But now? Now, they'd be under a microscope. "And if I refuse to cooperate?" he asked, though he already knew the answer. Aaliyah leaned back, folding her hands. "Then I hope you enjoy early retirement, Officer Dawson." Over the next few weeks, Ray felt the walls closing in. Every report he had written, every traffic stop he had made, every complaint filed against him, it was all being scrutinized. Then, the final blow came. A citywide press conference. Aaliyah Carter stood at the podium, poised and powerful. "After a full review of Fairview PD, we have uncovered a troubling pattern of racial profiling, abuse of power, and negligence in addressing misconduct. Effective immediately, Officer Ray Dawson has been suspended pending further investigation." Ray watched it unfold on his living room TV, his fists clenched. He had spent years thinking he was untouchable. Now, the very people he had oppressed were deciding his fate. And for the first time in his life, he knew what it felt like to be powerless. Ray Dawson sat in his dimly lit living room, gripping a half-empty bottle of whiskey. The press conference had shattered his world. 20 years of policing, and now he was a national disgrace. His phone had been buzzing non-stop, some calls from old colleagues who wanted to distance themselves, others from news outlets hungry for a statement. He ignored them all. Instead, he scrolled through social media, his face plastered on every major news site. Suspended Officer Ray Dawson under investigation for racial profiling. Community demands accountability for disgraced cop. He clicked on the comments. About damn time. How many innocent black folks did this guy harass before he got caught? I hope he rots in jail. Ray's stomach twisted. He had always believed he was doing his job, keeping order. Now, the world saw him as a villain. A loud knock at the door made him flinch. He set the bottle down and hesitated before answering. When he swung the door open, he nearly slammed it shut again. Dr. Aaliyah Carter stood on his porch. Ray's pulse pounded. "What the hell are you doing here?" Aaliyah looked calm, composed, like she had expected this reaction. "I came to talk." Ray laughed bitterly. "Talk? You already won. What more do you want?" Aaliyah sighed, stepping forward. "I don't want a victory, Dawson. I want change. But change only happens if people like you are willing to face the truth." He crossed his arms, leaning against the doorframe. "And what's the truth?" She studied him for a long moment. "That everything you believed about your job, about power, about who deserves respect, it was built on a lie. And now, you have a choice. You can stay bitter, play the victim, and blame the system for finally holding you accountable. Or you can take responsibility and do something meaningful with what time you have left." Ray scoffed. "And what? Become your puppet? Admit to the whole damn world that I was wrong?" Aaliyah's eyes were sharp but not unkind. "Admitting you were wrong is the first step. Making it right is the next." Ray didn't respond. He didn't know how. Aaliyah exhaled. "Look, I didn't come here to gloat. I came because no matter how much damage you've done, I believe people can change if they want to." Ray stared at her, anger and shame twisting inside him. For years, he had thought power meant control, meant dominance. But now, standing in front of the woman he once tried to intimidate, the woman who now held his fate in her hands, he realized he had never truly understood power at all. And for the first time, he wasn't sure who he was without it. Ray Dawson shut the door without another word, leaving Aaliyah Carter standing on his porch. His heart pounded in his chest. He told himself he didn't care what she had to say, that she was just another bureaucrat trying to tear down good cops. But as he sat back down, staring at his untouched whiskey, her words echoed in his head. You have a choice. For the next few days, Ray stayed locked in his house, avoiding the world. His email was flooded with legal notices, internal affairs requests, and messages from officers who once called him brother but now kept their distance. Then came the inevitable. A letter from the Fairview PD. Termination effective immediately. Ray read it 3 times, but the words didn't change. It was over. He wasn't just suspended anymore. He wasn't a cop at all. For the first time in 20 years, he had no badge, no authority, nothing. And yet, what haunted him more than losing his job was the realization that he didn't know who he was without it. 1 week later, Ray found himself at his usual diner, the kind of place where the coffee was burnt, but the waitress knew your name. Only this time, no one greeted him. No friendly nods from the regulars. Just silence. At first, he thought he was being paranoid. But then he saw the way people looked at him. Some with disgust. Others with pity. He had been a king in this town. Now, he was just another fallen man. He gritted his teeth and took a seat, determined to ignore the whispers. But then he heard a voice from behind him. Ray Dawson. Haven't seen you here in a while. He turned and saw Earl Johnson. A retired firefighter, Earl had been one of the few black men in Fairview who dared to challenge Ray's authority. The two had clashed more than once, mostly because Ray had pulled over Earl's sons for no reason other than fitting the description. Ray exhaled. Earl. Earl slid into the booth across from him, his expression unreadable. Saw you on the news. Ray didn't respond. Earl tilted his head. How's it feel? Ray frowned. How's what feel? To be on the other side, Earl said. To be the one people cross the street to avoid. The one folks whisper about. To know that no matter what you do now, your past is the first thing people see. Ray's jaw tightened. He stopped himself. Because the truth was, he had never given a damn when people like Earl told him exactly this. Earl nodded like he had already heard Ray's unfinished excuse. It's different when the badge is gone, isn't it? Ray looked down at his coffee, suddenly unable to meet Earl's eyes. For the first time, he understood. That night, Ray sat in his truck for over an hour before finally stepping out. He stood outside a building he never thought he'd willingly enter. The Fairview Community Justice Center. Inside, people were gathered for a town hall. Aaliyah Carter stood at the front, addressing a crowd of black and brown faces, people Ray had spent his career dismissing, harassing, and disregarding. He took a deep breath and stepped inside. The room went silent. All eyes turned to him. Aaliyah raised an eyebrow. Officer Dawson. Or, should I say Mr. Dawson? Ray swallowed his pride. I came to listen. Aaliyah studied him for a long moment. Then, slowly, she nodded. Then take a seat. For the first time in his life, Ray did just that. And for the first time in his life, he was ready to learn. Ray Dawson sat in the back of the room, arms crossed, his presence still met with side eyes and murmurs. He was used to commanding attention as a cop, but now, stripped of his badge, he felt smaller than ever. Dr. Aaliyah Carter continued her speech at the front. Accountability is the first step. But accountability without change means nothing. Ray exhaled slowly. He wasn't sure why he had come here. Maybe it was curiosity. Maybe it was guilt. Maybe it was the nagging realization that his world had changed, and if he didn't change with it, he'd have nothing left. A young black man stood up. "We're tired of cops like Dawson profiling us, treating us like criminals in our own town. And now we're supposed to believe he's suddenly here to listen?" The room murmured in agreement. Ray felt every eye on him. The weight of his past mistakes settled heavily on his chest. Aaliyah didn't rush to defend him. Instead, she turned to Ray. "Well, do you have anything to say for yourself?" Ray cleared his throat. I don't expect anyone to trust me. I don't even know if I trust myself right now." His voice was rough, unfamiliar. "But I know I've done wrong. I spent years thinking I was upholding the law, but I was really just upholding my own ignorance. And I'm here because..." He hesitated, then forced the words out. "Because I don't want to be that man anymore." Silence. Then, Earl Johnson, the retired firefighter, let out a dry chuckle. "That's a start." Over the next few months, Ray kept showing up. At first, people ignored him, waiting for him to disappear. But he didn't. He sat through meetings where people tore into the police department, reliving stories of harassment, many at his hands. He volunteered for community outreach programs, cleaning up parks and helping at youth centers, despite the glares he received. He worked under Earl at the local fire station, learning how to serve the community without a gun and badge to hide behind. The hardest part wasn't the work. It was realizing how much damage he had done. One afternoon, he saw a familiar face, a teenage boy he had once arrested for loitering when he was just standing outside a gas station. The boy recognized him instantly. "You ruined my life," the kid said, his voice full of anger. Ray had nothing to say in his defense. "I won't ask you to forgive me," he finally said. "But if there's ever a way I can make it right, I'll do it." The boy scoffed. "You can't." And he walked away. Ray stood there, the weight of those words settling in his chest. Change, he realized, wouldn't come with a single apology. Some wounds didn't heal. Some people would never accept him. And he had to live with that. A different kind of power. One evening, Ray sat on the steps of the Fairview Community Justice Center, exhausted from another day of work. Aaliyah Carter walked up beside him. "You're still here," she noted. Ray smirked. "You sound surprised." She shrugged. "People like you don't usually stick around when it gets hard." He nodded, glancing at the street. "It should have been hard for me a long time ago." Aaliyah studied him for a moment. "You know, redemption isn't about proving something to me. Or anyone else." Ray sighed. "Then what's it about?" She gave him a small, knowing smile. "It's about proving to yourself that you can be better than who you were." For the first time in his life, Ray Dawson finally understood what real power was. Not the kind that came from a badge. The kind that came from facing the truth. And choosing, every single day, to be different. Months passed. Ray Dawson had traded his uniform for work boots, his gun for a broom, and his authority for humility. Every morning, he woke up early and helped at the fire station, swept sidewalks outside local businesses, and volunteered at youth centers. He listened to people he once dismissed. He saw their pain, the kind he had helped create. But not everyone was willing to let him rewrite his story. One night, after closing up the community center, he walked to his truck and found the words "racist pig" spray painted across the side. His tires were slashed. Ray clenched his jaw. A year ago, he would have blamed criminals. Now, he knew better. He sat on the curb, staring at the vandalism. He didn't feel anger. He felt exhaustion. A voice cut through the night. "Guess you ain't so untouchable now, huh?" Ray turned. A group of young men stood across the street. One of them, the same teenager he had once arrested for loitering, stared at him with cold eyes. Ray sighed. "I suppose not." The boy smirked. "Good. Now you know how it feels." Ray didn't argue. What was there to say? The young men walked away, laughing bitterly. Ray exhaled, rubbing his face. "You have to prove it to yourself." Aaliyah's words echoed in his mind. Ray pulled out his phone and dialed. "You still up?" he asked when Earl Johnson picked up. Earl sighed. "You gonna make me come out there, aren't you?" "Yep," Ray muttered, staring at the spray paint. "Gonna need a ride." A few weeks later, Ray was cleaning up a park when he saw a familiar face. The boy who slashed his tires stood by a basketball court, hands stuffed in his hoodie. Ray hesitated, then walked over. "Hey." The boy didn't look at him. "What, you gonna call the cops on me?" Ray shook his head. "No. Just wanted to ask if you'd help me paint over some graffiti. Someone tagged the community center last night." The boy scoffed. "Why the hell would I help you?" Ray shrugged. "You wouldn't be helping me. You'd be helping your neighborhood." The boy narrowed his eyes, as if searching for some hidden trick. But Ray had no badge, no authority, just an offer. After a long pause, the boy muttered, "Maybe." It wasn't forgiveness. It wasn't redemption. But it was a start. 1 year later, Ray Dawson stood at the podium of Fairview's first community-led policing initiative. Dr. Aaliyah Carter introduced him. "Today, we have someone who once represented everything wrong with the system. But instead of running, he stayed. And he's worked to rebuild the trust he helped break." Ray stepped up, scanning the crowd. He saw familiar faces, some still skeptical, some cautiously supportive. And in the back, the boy from the basketball court, arms crossed. Ray took a deep breath. "I used to believe that power came from authority," he said. "But I learned the hard way that real power comes from accountability. From choosing to be better than you were yesterday." Silence. Then, applause, hesitant at first, then stronger. Ray didn't smile. He knew this wasn't a victory. There was no final redemption, no erasing the past. But there was change. And for the first time, he knew he was walking the right path. Not as a cop, but as a man.